Today I will introduce the Smith Ragan Instructional Design Model. The Smith Ragan Instructional Design Model is based on Gagne's conditions of learning and the cognitive learning theory. As a result of a 5-year project, the pair published their book, Instructional Design, in 1993 that outlines their model. This is a diagram that illustrates the Smith Ragan Model Instructional Design, which is comprised of 3 major phases: analysis, strategy, and evaluation. And within each phase, there are multiple steps that guide the designers during the development of the instruction. While the diagram appears very linear, Smith and Ragan believe that the instructional design process can be better illustrated by the ball of worms figure that depicts the interrelatedness of the activities of the design process. So let's take a look at each phase in their design model. The first phase, analysis phase, is comprised of 4 steps. The first step is to analyze the learning context. This step is broken down into 2 smaller steps: 1, conducting a needs assessment, and 2, describing the learning environment. By conducting a needs assessment, the designer can validate the need for instruction, and the designer must take on the role of a detective to determine if the instruction can solve the problem. The second smaller step in this phase is to describe the learning context. The designer must consider the environment in which the instruction will be implemented, which includes the learners, the teachers, the instructional materials, equipment, facilities, and the organization as a whole. At the end of this step, the designer should create a list of goals that reflect what the learners are unable to do. The second step in the analysis phase is to analyze the actual learner. It is important to know the target audience in order to create effective and interesting instruction. This also assists the designer in setting the pace, creating relevance of the material, and determining the groupings. Smith and Ragan focus on analyzing learner characteristics that are different, similar, stable, and changing. This step can be accomplished by observing the target audience, interviewing teachers or supervisors, examining job descriptions, or administering a survey to the learners. Step 3 in the analysis phase is to analyze the tasks. According to Smith and Ragan, the purpose of this step is to transform the goals identified in the needs assessment into a form that can be used to guide subsequent design. During this step, the designer will write learning objectives for each goal. This step is where the influence of Gagne's conditions of learning is evident. Gagne developed 5 learning categories: verbal, intellectual, cognitive, attitude, and psychomotor. The designer must remember that the main goal of this step is what the learner must do, and not how you will teach it. The fourth and final step of the analysis phase is to write the test items. And you may be thinking, isn't this step out of place? I haven't written the instruction yet. Smith and Ragan placed this step directly after writing the learning objectives to ensure that the assessment items actually assess the objectives that will be taught. The test items should directly align with the objectives. Smith and Ragan state that if you have trouble writing a test question, consider rewriting the objective. Designers must also develop assessments that are reliable, valid, and practical. The second phase, the strategy phase, includes 2 steps. The first step, step 5, includes identifying organizational, delivery, and management strategies. And we're going to split this into 3 slides because of the amount of information. So the first part of step 5 is to identify the organizational strategies. Designers must decide on the scope and sequence of the instruction, including what content will be presented and how it will be presented. Smith and Ragan described the organization of a lesson to include the intro, the body, the conclusion, and the assessment. It is here that we see the influence of Gagne's 9 events of instruction. But what makes this unique to Smith and Ragan is that they expanded Gagne's 9 events into 15 events of instruction to guide the designer. Part B of this step is to determine the delivery strategies. During this step, designers must decide on the appropriate media for instruction and to determine the grouping strategy. Designers must ask what will be used to deliver instruction: the teacher, computer, print, or video. When choosing the media, designers must consider the learning tasks, instructional conditions, learner characteristics, context, and media attributes. The designer must also determine how to group the students. The last part of Step 5 is to determine the management strategies. Management strategies actually orchestrate the organization and delivery strategies. In this step, the designer identifies the scheduling of the instructional events and mechanisms for delivering these. And when choosing this strategy, the designer must consider data gathered during the analysis phase. Step 6 in the strategy phase is to actually write and produce the instruction. During this step, the designer must translate decisions made in the previous steps into the actual instruction. Smith and Ragan describe 4 types of instruction: print-based, computer-based, instructional video, and teacher-based, which corresponds directly with decisions made in the previous step. The final phase in Smith and Ragan's model is the evaluation phase, and the first step in this phase is to conduct the formative evaluation. This step has a twofold purpose: 1, to assess learner performance, and 2, to assess the effectiveness of instruction. During this step, the designer asks and answers the question, did the instruction solve the problem? Smith and Ragan state that designers should question their decisions throughout each step of the design. Other forms of formative evaluation include a review by a subject matter expert and tryouts of the instruction prior to officially implementing that instruction. The final step in the evaluation phase is to make revisions to the instruction based on the results of the formative evaluations conducted in the previous steps. So in conclusion, the Smith and Ragan ID model, based on Gagne's conditions of learning and the cognitive learning theory, consists of 3 major phases that include 8 steps for creating instruction. And again, although it appears linear, each step is interrelated, impacting the designer's decisions. So in conclusion, this model provides designers with a highly detailed guide to developing effective instruction.